Good evening. My name is Doreen and I work here, and I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Alan Johnson, who was the main researcher for our exhibit in the Heath Gallery, Unintended, sorry I forgot the name, worked on it too for a year, Unintended Consequences, World War I and the 1918 Influenza. And he was the main researcher for, he said, exactly a year here, which I didn't realize to the day. And he was going to share with you that experience and some interesting things he found out. And the only requirement we have at the museum is that he has to wear a face mask while he's giving the speech. And he has to wear the representative helmet that the Wizard of Flues wears with school children. Would you do that, please?
Certainly.
All right. It gets rather uncomfortable, but on the top somebody asked what that was. That is actually the influenza virus. What it looks like under a microscope, and that is a World War I helmet. So it kind of puts the story together for you.
Well, I'm going to have this on for about another second here. I've got to say it's the most, I'm an Army veteran, and that's the most interesting helmet I ever wore. And that's my grandson. He's the only one allowed to ask questions. No. My name's Alan Johnson, and for a year I was privileged to be a volunteer. I was carried on the books as a volunteer. I was actually placed here by the Veterans Administration as a work experience project. I'm a disabled vet, and it turned out to be just a fascinating trip. I'm a historical nut by avocation, if not vocation. And when I was first told that they had this exhibit, I knew very little. I knew in passing that, yeah, there had been this flu epidemic. It happened about the time of the war, but knew very little about it. And the amazing thing was that I was drawn into the thing both personally. Montana's such a small state that I found out pretty quick that I was personally impacted by some of the early stories of that, which I hadn't realized. Little history of friends and family that just surfaced while we were starting this thing out. But just to give a little bit of an overview, and then what I'd like to do is move into the exhibit itself and kind of have that audio visual, because I think you can get tired of looking at me as pretty as I am for a whole hour standing behind a lectern. So I think it'd be more interesting, and that we're being filmed, I guess, by MCAT, the local community access cable, and he's going to try his best. He didn't realize that I wanted to have a walking lecture, but he's game. So the story kind of starts, and and I'll just give a little bit of this before we go in, but it starts with some things that was too broad for the exhibit. But I just want to kind of catch you up to where medical science was, or was not, at the time immediately preceding this and the time of the flu itself. One of the articles I read is by a Bozeman physician. I think he's retired now, Volney Steele, who's also a historian. And Volney has a book out called Bleed, Blister, and Purge. And it sums up what medical science was in the 19th century. They believed that they needed to let things out of you. That was the only way to make you better. So they either opened up your veins and bled you, or they gave you something to cause diarrhea, or they even used irritants on your skin, which would raise blisters, which they thought somehow was the bad spirits kind of working their way to the surface. And American medicine had come such a long way that in 1876, Johns Hopkins University was founded. And it was founded with the idea of kind of ending this scientific dark ages. They were way ahead of us in Europe. Medical schools in the United States did not teach science. You didn't need to know any science. You didn't need to have a college degree to get in the way you do today. All you required to have was the money. And the medical schools were all private. They relied on local physicians for the faculty. And you only needed the money, and the faculty was only paid out of the money you sent. So that was kind of their interest in the thing. And in 76, when Johns Hopkins was founded, they set out to have a state-of-the-art medical school that would incorporate all this science from Europe. And it took them, partly because of the panic of fitting into history, and that, we had a panic of 1873, and we had a kind of a tough economic time in the 1870s, and part of that was that most of the endowment for Johns Hopkins University was B&O Railroad money, and it was mostly in stock, so the value went down, and it wasn't until 1894 that they established the medical school finally. A survey was done in 1901 of American medical schools and found only 3 out of a few hundred that actually were considered to be anything near state-of-the-art. After that survey, most of them closed, and gradually they begin to build up the science of medicine. But it happened so rapidly that by 1917, at the time we entered the war, we had caught up to and were state-of-the-art to the rest of the world. That's how fast they had moved with this thing. And so, though we may think what they knew in 1917 was pretty primitive compared to us now, they were at the cutting edge. They had the best science available, and yet when this flu hit, it took them totally by surprise. They didn't know what to do with it. Everything they thought they had learned with all this state-of-the-art science was totally inadequate to handle this thing. So if we could, we're going to go to the exhibit, and we can kind of work with what's there, and we'll take you around the tour, and we'll talk about the flu. We'll talk a little bit about World War I and of course, Montana and the history of the time. Okay, now the flu, as it was known, probably made its first appearance in Camp Funston, Kansas, which is adjacent to Fort Riley, which still exists as a military post. Camp Funston at the time was a gathering place for the draftees they were starting to bring in as they build up the Army for our presence in the war, which, of course, as most of you know, we entered late. The war had been going since 1914 in Europe, and we did not enter the war until 1917 and didn't really fight it to any great extent until 1918. The disease picked up at Funston. They had several people infected. They had some deaths from that, but at the time it wasn't really a world-shaking event, just kind of a bad episode. Nobody saw this. Had hindsight at that time to see this as the beginning of this great epidemic. But it was the beginning of what they call the first wave of the flu worldwide. Now the flu was called the Spanish flu, and it's entirely a misnomer. The flu didn't begin in Spain. The only reason many have speculated as to why the Spanish kind of got tagged with the thing is the war was on when the flu started. Spain was neutral, was not a participant in the war, thus had no wartime censorship. That time they considered things like national epidemics and stuff like that to be serious security matters. You don't want the enemy to know that everybody's getting sick. Well, everybody's getting sick on both sides of the war, but it wasn't put in the papers or anything of that sort. And so when the first news of big outbreaks came, it came out of Spain, where there was no censorship. So the poor Spanish got tagged with this greatest epidemic that we've had, or pandemic. As we said, the first wave came and went kind of unnoticed. It was only really discovered statistically later. At Camp Funston, they didn't know what had caused this wave of illness. Some speculated that they had been cleaning up years and years of manure droppings from when Fort Riley was the cavalry center, and they had that summer burned it all in mass. And unfortunate wind had put a pall of smoke around the base. So many speculated, that was it. Burning all that manure did it. And nobody knew what to tie it to. But the second wave is the one we talk about. That's the one that got world attention. And it seems to have started in about 3 major seaport towns, one of those being Boston in the United States. The other in Sierra Leone in Africa, a major port city. And the pandemic just spread out from these areas and was quickly around the world. For example, the most remote areas of the world suffered the epidemic. The remote villages in Alaska got it. The biggest cities suffered the epidemic. It didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. Being crowded in a big city didn't make you any more likely or less likely to catch the flu than being up in pristine Alaska. It hit, and it was extremely virulent. And the characteristic of it that most frightened everybody was when flu epidemics come, and they do come and go. People die of the flu all the time, but they hit the youngest in the population, and they hit the oldest. It's what they call a U-shaped graph if they're going to plot it. The youngest who hadn't developed immunization systems yet, and the oldest who had weakened immunization systems. But this one went in a W. In other words, they had some death at the oldest and the youngest, but the death raged through young adults, supposedly with the strongest immune systems. The ages from 18 to 40 were especially deadly, and it would strike many of the people with that, and they would be dead within 48 hours. Totally healthy on Wednesday, dead on Friday. Of course, the war in the United States had a lot to do with how fast it spread, because we had all these country boys and city boys and everything for the first time getting congregated into these camps. We were building an army that they had expected to build to 4 million men. We only had 100,000 in the army at the start of this thing. So they had no camps ready. They had these vast tent cities in places like Camp Funston in Kansas and all that. And when this epidemic hit, it just swept through these camps. But it started in Boston. It started 2 places. Fort Devens, which is still a military fort, but it was called Camp Devens at the time, and that was a big concentration. And it started on what the Navy called, they actually called it a ship, but basically it was the reception station for everybody entering the Navy, which was in Boston at the time. And those places were hit so fiercely by this thing that the morgue couldn't keep up. They literally had stacked dead. And all of it was these young men in their 20s that just got there. Totally 43,000 of the 116,000 servicemen that died during World War I died of this flu. It was, and ironically, many of them died after only being in uniform for a few weeks. They'd come from home by train, from wherever they came from, been in this camp, got sick, and were dead within a few days. The disease, of course, spread in Europe too, and it was in the trenches and that. But many of these guys never got out of Kansas or never got out of the United States at all. The United States Navy, in fact, the disease spread in the ships so badly that actually 90% of the World War I deaths in the Navy were from this flu. The Navy did not have that many casualties. There wasn't a lot of surface battles in World War I. But a lot of the ships were ravaged with the flu, and some were rendered virtually inoperable. Didn't have enough healthy guys to get the ship going. It spread in troop ships, and they feel that actually some of the worst part of the epidemic had come over from the United States in the troop ships. They wound up having to quarantine guys at the main port at that time for the landings of the American troops coming to World War I was at Brest on the west coast of France. That's not where we landed World War II because the Nazis held it for the entire war. But that was the main port, and ships were quarantined immediately. They were bringing the guys off the boat in stretchers. They had, more than half the population of the ship incapacitated, and had just very little way to fight it. But to show you how this thing got kind of personal really fast, in reading Dr. Steele's article, he traced the first case in Montana, which started, believe it or not, in Scobie. Now, everybody know where Scobie is? For those who don't, Scobie is it's a county seat, but it's a fairly remote town way up in northeastern Montana, just about 10-15 miles below the Canadian border, up in that corner between North Dakota, Saskatchewan, and that. They don't know how it got to Scobie, but the girl that died from that was a 16-year-old named Viola Paz. Now, my dad, who's here, he was an only son in a family of girls, and so was his best friend in Opine, Royal Paz. And as soon as I saw that name, I said, gee, that name's not that common. I called Royal up, and he says, yeah, she was my aunt. But he had no idea she had died as the very first fatality, much less even in the epidemic. But that's the earliest we could trace that. Was in Scobie. Almost the same time, in fact, reported the next day was the flu in a sailor who was on leave in Whitehall. Now, in both Scobie and Whitehall, it spread, but it wasn't long before it hit the towns, and it spread from many sources because there's no diagram or pattern that shows it coming out of eastern Montana and spreading, or coming out of Whitehall and spreading. It just, those are probably the first places, and they reason that probably the way it got to Scobie might have been a serviceman on leave that carried the virus. But they don't know. They haven't tracked that down. They do know that the first case in Whitehall was a sailor on leave who undoubtedly brought it from the base he had been at. Montana wasn't set up to handle such a thing, and it took them a little while to realize that they're in the throes of this thing. Plus, Montana missed this first wave entirely. Now, to put credit where credit is due, if there's one person whose research I owe a lot of what I put together to, it's Ellen Leahy, who's the county health officer. Ellen has this graph, which is right here. It basically shows the flu in Missoula as a two-wave thing. There wasn't any, as near as we can tell statistically and everything else, there wasn't any first wave in Montana. Montana and this part of the interior West somehow just didn't get hit by it. But when the killer wave came in, this is how it grew. In Missoula, we had our first cases out at the fort. And that started in the first week of October of 1918. Now, to set this up a little bit of what's in Missoula at the time, the fort has always had a small military presence off and on, and at the time of the beginning of the war, they had located a mechanic school here. And of course, World War I was the first kind of mechanized war, and so they were training Army mechanics at the fort. Now, the university, of course, was running, and at the time, the Army had envisioned that this huge buildup, they were going to run out of officer material pretty quick. So they established what might sound a little bit like ROTC is today, ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, but they called it the Student Army Training Corps. And that was the idea that, first of all, the only people eligible were young men who were not eligible for the draft. The first draft call, unlike the more modern draft calls we had in Vietnam and all that, didn't start at 18. They wanted young men from 21 to age 30. And so that's one of the things. You couldn't be an SATC if you're draft eligible. You couldn't go to school in those days to escape the draft or belong in the SATC. And it was a little bit unlike ROTC, and where ROTC students pretty much are other students, except for they wear their uniforms every once in a while. These guys were as in the military. They first housed them in a tent city, and we'll see that in a minute as we go around the exhibit. But they housed them in a tent city, which was behind Main Hall. And at the same time, they were building wooden barracks. And these wooden barracks became campus buildings that lasted into the 50s before they were torn down. But the wooden barracks eventually replaced those. But this epidemic hit in the Student Army Training Corps. It hit in the fort about the same time, and this is before we had cases showing up in town. The Student Army Training Corps eventually had 5 of its students died of the flu or secondary infections. Some with their weakened systems actually succumbed to pneumonia was the main thing. In Missoula, they also had a strain of scarlet fever that followed that, and that took people. Is there any questions so far?
It would seem to me that people should be questioning carriers like birds, even then. Huh?
Well, they didn't, because first of all, get back to medical science, though it was state of the art for its time, they did not know anything about viruses. The best medical science at the time said bacteria cause disease. And so the scientific minds, when this thing was growing, they were looking for the bacterial agent that was starting it. So they weren't thinking really of animal-borne diseases or anything like that at the time. They assumed it was a bacteria. There had even been an experiment had been done during an earlier flu epidemic in England by a scientist named Pfeiffer, and he developed what he called the Pfeiffer's bacillus, which was turned out to be a secondary infection, but he mistook it as the cause. And for a while they were operating on the theory that this was a Pfeiffer's bacillus outbreak. And of course, they were wrong. But yeah, at that point, nobody was looking at animal-borne disease carriers or anything like that.
How did they think it was transmitted through, like, TB, or how?
Well, it was transmitted just human-to-human contact.
I mean, you know, there are various routes. There's through aerosols or whatever.
Well, yeah, it'd be an airborne thing, yeah, but human-to-human contact, both touch and breathing.
What percentage of people who did get the flu survived?
Oh, well, most survived. I mean, as terrible as the flu was and the big death toll it took, still your chances were better you would recover. But for example, nearly 2% of all Montanans who contracted the flu died of it, which was one of the 4 highest death tolls among the states in the United States. And so in Montana, which was a lot of rural towns at the time, we had that, and we were competing with Pennsylvania, which was #1, and mostly because the epidemic just ravaged Philadelphia, just had the piling up the bodies.
What percentage survived? Do we have a feel for that? That contacted the flu?
Well, for example, in Montana, if 2% died, that means 98% survived.
Okay, but
Yeah.
what kind of number did the 98% represent?
Oh, how many?
Yeah,
Well, the death toll of Montana was about 6,000, so
okay.
you go up from there. Now, part of the thing is we don't have a hand on exactly what the population was at this time. As some of you who studied Montana history know, eastern Montana was virtually unpopulated until they revised the Homestead Acts in 1910. And that they finally revised it so that somebody could file on a full section of land. Now that's still a pretty small farm in Montana, but then that was enough to bring people out here. And the thing was that this whole thing peaked and then went downhill, and Montana was already plunging into a long. We had the Great Depression 10 to 15 years started in Montana before the rest of the nation got it. I mean, we had hard times in Montana, and they really started around 1917. But lost my train of thought picking up this thing. Remind me where I was.
I can't.
Hard times in Montana.
Yeah, oh yeah, the economy and all that. We had, and the population, some historians have estimated that fully half of the people that came in during the homesteading boom had left before the 1920 census, for example. And of course, there's no way to account for that. And of course, those are just estimates. There's no exact count of who came in and who left. There's just some idea they have from land filings and other records that were generated at the time. But of course, between the 1910 census and the 1920, Montana virtually doubled in size, but it had even that many more. Which is another thing that is an interesting figure in the war, in that Montana contributed way over the percentage that most other states did. One was because the economy was bad. A lot of young men out of work, they joined the Army. The other was because the government created an estimate of Montana's population that was 50% more than actually was there, and that meant we had a bigger draft quota than our population justified. So for those reasons, Montana contributed per capita more than any other state in the Union to
Remind me what year the draft started again? 14?
Well, that 1917 is when they
First draft?
Yeah, started taking them. We entered the war in April of 17, and that's when they started to mobilize. See if we can kind of move around. I kind of want to get to the university exhibit here and kind of illustrate what they had. And here it is. Yeah.
Sorry.
Now this is an example of, you can recognize some of these buildings. 3 of these buildings exist. We had 4 buildings on campus in 1917. Main Hall, of course. This area here, this is gone. This is Science Hall. The Honors College newer building is in its place now. This was actually a woman's dormitory at the time, but most more recent students of U of M know it as the math building. And then over here, this was the Natural Science Hall, which was just completing construction at the time. Now you can see the tent city they had at this time. The shot is obviously taken from upslope on Mount Sentinel a little ways. You can see how sparse the population was out at this point. The city was primarily on the north side of the river, and the campus here. But this gives you an idea of how they were kind of crowded together, and this epidemic swept through the students here. Behind you see the under construction, these wooden buildings, which later became incorporated into the university. In fact, one for a long time was the Student Health Service, and that kind of grew out of the fact that once they were built, they had become kind of a hospital for the SATC students. Now, to show you how Montana responded to this thing, and that's why I wanted to get to this side, to Montana and principally Missoula, was when this thing hit, they and just gathered so fast, you could kind of follow this in the Missoulian, and that it took them a while to realize how serious the thing was. But once they did, what the Missoula City Council did is, to the city health officer, a Dr. Ritchie, they gave him virtually the ability to rule by decree, as long as it, had something to do, of course, with the flu epidemic. So he could take action. And just to show you just how total this thing was, the university shut down. Just it, right? They just started fall quarter at the time. It shut down. Grizzlies didn't play football, nothing. All the schools in town shut down. Not only that, but they forbade church services. You couldn't meet for church. And what the Missoulian did then is it made its Sunday pages available for local ministers, and so the local ministers wrote sermons which ran in the Sunday paper for their parishioners. Now, the strangest thing about this is, as you might suspect, they closed all these public places. You couldn't gather at the library or anything like that, but the saloons were open. Now, what's kind of funny about this is the saloons were going to close anyway. In 1916, the Montana voters had voted the state dry, and that was to take effect January 1, 1919. So perhaps maybe the local officials felt they'd have a lot of pressure about closing them earlier than they're going to close anyway. But it took them a while. And there were letters to the editor of the Missoulian. You can say, I can't go into the library anymore. I never saw more than 10 people there at any one time. And you go downtown in all these saloons, and there's all these guys in here. Well, they first try to control it. They're just resisting shutting down saloons. So the first thing they do is say, well, we created a move-on ordinance. Get your drink and move on. Well, they had a hard time with that. So they decided, well, people would move on better if they had no place to sit. So they literally gathered every bar stool in the saloons in Missoula, and they were all warehoused, all stacked in a warehouse someplace. No place to sit in the saloons. Keep moving. It wasn't until December, which is after the whole killer wave peaked, and just before the second wave, which also was fairly deadly, kicked in, that they finally closed the saloons. Well, they were going to close anyway, January 1. They just closed a month early is what it amounted to. But just a little kind of an interesting sidelight, but really the whole town really took it on as a cause. The war was going on at the time, and that certainly dominated the top of the front page, the way they did that at the time, but also this flu was on the front page. And of course, news was sketchy. If you were to read the Missoulian, you'd think the thing went back and forth like this, because they would report every piece of bad news as, oh, terrible, terrible, and really somber. And then you get a little bit of good news, they're down a little bit, and it's all over. It was practically the way the paper would do it. Well, it didn't go over. It went in a steady arc, as you saw, peaked, and then down. But it's kind of the way the news was reported at the time. The Missoulian editors, and just to explain a little bit about the Missoulian at the time, the Missoulian, unbeknownst to people in Missoula, and even according to his own history, the editor of the Missoulian at the time, Martin Hutchins, had passed into the ownership of the Anaconda Company. And as some of you know, Montana history know, the Anaconda Copper Company eventually controlled all of the major dailies in the state except the one in Great Falls. But they actually bought this paper from one of their enemies, who was Joseph Dixon. Joseph Dixon, he had been a congressman, he had been a U.S. senator at the time, and had finished in the Senate and was back editing the paper and being involved in various business interests. The Montana building downtown, corner of Broadway and Higgins, the six-story older building that's there, that's his building. He built that to, I guess, arguably the first skyscraper in Missoula, before the Wilma Building. But at any rate, Dixon had bought the Missoulian in the 1890s and was the editor right up until the war started. And of course, it was a front group that amazingly got out of Chicago, that amazingly got this financing instantly in Spokane, that bought the paper from him. Well, they represent the Anaconda Company. The Anaconda Company just didn't make it public until 1923.
Did it affect the native population, the Indians?
Yeah. In fact, some were hit very hard. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation was especially hard hit and had a very high death toll there. Strangely enough, as ethnic goes, the African Americans statistically seem to suffer less, even in the cities where you would think they were more crowded together and that sort of thing. And there's nothing to explain that, but statistically it's true that the African Americans seem to get over the disease a little better. The Native Americans, though not, certainly in the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, they had a terrible death toll. Any other questions? Well, anyway, the Missoulian, that just a little sidelight to what happened in the ownership, but it was the Missoulian of these new people that was publishing during the flu epidemic. And they weren't afraid to push things. The Missoulian, for example, and some people in town decided that the thing that was needed in town was to have a school nurse. And the Missoulian editorialized for that, and there was quite a fight on that. And the Missoulian would imply, they always had these little one-paragraph hits in there, and they would imply that school board members that didn't vote to hire a school nurse would have people at their door when the little coffins started piling up and that kind of stuff. I mean, that was the kind of flavor of the Missoulian at the time. And when the school board didn't do that, the Missoulian put it on the paper and all but accused the school board and the administration of not caring. And then you get a letter to the editor from the superintendent, which fortunately they did publish at least, which said in fact he felt they'd done better than the school nurse because his policy was that a doctor would actually be summoned for any student that got sick in school, and then that student would be quarantined and not allowed to return to school. So he thought he and the school board were very unfairly treated and portrayed as not doing anything at all when they thought they had just taken the better option. So that's at any rate, that's kind of how Missoula was at the peak, and then gradually the epidemic died down into September, and they thought they were safe in reopening the university. Now, I pointed out here this was the woman's dorm at the time, and when the university reopened after winter quarter, the flu swept through again. And it swept through particularly badly among the young co-eds that were staying there, and two young women, both 18 years old, just freshmen, died in the second wave that hit Missoula, which was part of the third wave internationally. So the university wasn't through suffering from that, and neither was Missoula. Missoula had cases where an entire family would die. And in one case, strangely enough, it was an entire family of adults who didn't live together that managed to die. The son, the older daughters, all died within week periods after their mother had died of the thing. It took people a lot that way, and then other households it managed. Not everybody caught the flu either. And what they assume is that strains of this flu had been through before, not so deadly, and that a lot of people had antibodies to it. Because, as we know, 100% of the people didn't catch the flu. So some people had immune systems that fought off this thing. Now, to get into why these young people died so much, and this is the theory they're going with, they don't know for sure, but they have a pretty good idea, is that it was actually the healthy immune systems which killed these people. What they found in doing autopsies, cutting open the lungs, was that the lungs were just chocked full of this frothy red stuff. They had literally drowned in their own fluids. And they had a theory then that possibly it was the immune system doing this, but this is recently corroborated somewhat by experiments on primates. The flu virus, it wasn't until the 1930s that they discovered that flu was viral, that they tied it to a virus. And they didn't isolate the particular virus here until recently in the 90s. And the way they did that is they had reasoned that people that had died in the Arctic regions, their bodies might be still frozen and well preserved, and maybe they could find some strain. Now here's the funny thing, it shows how just a little private effort versus a big major government effort goes. They had this big, super financed money from the US government, other governments, to unearth some miners who had been buried in Spitsbergen, which is an island above the Arctic Circle off of Norway. And it was a huge project, and it had all the publicity with it. It had the science reporters of the major newspapers and magazines. They were all on for this expedition. And on the other hand, you had a retired physician, a pathologist, who had an idea. In 1959, he had first had an idea, and this is before they understood much about DNA or anything, but he thought maybe he had this idea about discovering bodies in the Arctic, and he visited an Alaskan village and got permission from the villagers to exhume bodies. This village, all but 4 people had died when it swept through the village in 1918. So he was thinking he would actually find a preserved virus, and of course that part of it failed. He didn't. He did manage to unearth bodies. They were fairly well preserved, but his experiment didn't work. Well, he goes on to a career as a pathologist in California, and when the news starts breaking of the first time they isolated and discovered part of the RNA that builds this thing was when the Army, Dr. Jeffrey Taubenberger from the Armed Forces Pathology Institute, went through and found that they had preserved slides all the way from 1918. They had preserved slides of some 20 young servicemen. And in one of those, he was able to reconstruct part of the RNA code. And of course, that hit the scientific journals, and this pathologist saw it, and his idea sprung again, and he put it to Taubenberger. Now, he saw no money or anything. He financed this himself out of his savings. He simply went back up there, asked the tribe that ran the village if he could exhume bodies again for the possibility that they might be able to get some DNA off of them. And they said, sure. He hired 4 local young men to help him dig. They managed to pull up a sample out of there was some deterioration, but they found a woman who had been very obese when she died, and the obesity had actually helped with the preservation. And so he got specimens from her, and from those, he sent those on to Taubenberger. And they did successfully track the code from this woman. Meanwhile, the huge expedition into Spitsbergen, finally they get here, and after all this, they dig into these miners' graves. They find out they only buried them 2 feet deep. The only thing that's left in there are bones with some little beef jerky attached to them, and they get for all the money and all the publicity and everything, they get nothing useful at all from this. So I thought it was just useful. Little backyard science gets it done, and the huge government project fizzles.
What year were these studies going on?
These were in the late 90s, and don't ask me to get the specific year, but we're talking 97, 98.
Did the Public Health Service down here at Hamilton ever get involved?
Not that I'm aware of. I can't say yes or no, but I'm not aware of any involvement they had. They were principally set up, for Rocky Mountain spotted fever at the beginning. So I don't. Nothing I've read. They've talked primarily about the Army Pathology Institute as the ones that stayed on this, had a dedicated scientist, Taubenberger, who just took this on as his project. Yeah, and they've gone away from it. Using that reconstructed code, by the way, they've been able to recreate the virus, and that's what they infected these primates with, that's getting around. that's what I was getting around to here. With that, they tried an experiment on some primates. Young primates should have had good immune systems, and they died just like these young adults had in 1917. And in the autopsies, they found the same thing. Basically, their immune systems had so overreacted, something in that virus, they don't know what yet, caused their immune systems to just overreact. And all that creation of extracellular fluid and everything has literally caused them to drown, these poor monkeys who got into a study they never signed up for, probably. But that's kind of where they are with it. They still don't know why. As Taubenberger said, we know the murderer. We just don't know how he did it. And that remains today. We don't know. There's a lot of theories. A gentleman mentioned animal-borne. They're looking at avian flu and things like that, but they still haven't positively tied this virus to avian flu. They did try to recover some, as they did with soldiers. They found out that there were preserved birds from that era. So they tried to go through them, see if they could discover any evidence, and they didn't. So doesn't mean it wasn't there or anything, but certainly it didn't exist in these samples that happened to have been.
There's a ghost town in Missouri, right halfway across the state, called Fremont, and it's very close to the Arkansas line. The War Chemical Board in 1917 decided that American aircraft, like these little models, were burning up, or Allied aircraft, because of the fabric had been doped with nitrate, and the Krauts were using 1 in 6 tracers, and they would light the skin of the airplane on fire, and these guys did have parachutes. So the War Chemical Board said we should have cellulose acetate, which burns very slowly, to dope the fabric. And then they went and created 14 cellulose acetate plants, which work like wood tar, and they put one in at this place called Fremont. And the tallest smokestack in Missouri is there. And if you go to the plant and you poke your nose into one of the sewers, you can smell like model airplane glue, even today, 1918, 19. But the fact is, there's a hilltop, it's got 200 graves ascribed to deaths from the influenza.
No kidding. Huh.
Fremont.
Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that.
How many deaths worldwide?
Worldwide, they can only estimate, because most of the world didn't have modern record keeping. They know that they would, in Indonesia, they would come to villages and there wasn't a soul living. Those kind of deaths they couldn't wrap a number on. So they've talked about an estimate of anywhere from 20 million to 100 million deaths. But they just don't know, because for most, we know by record keeping that about 675,000 Americans died in the United States. We know that 43,000 of our soldiers died from either that or secondary. The 43,000 includes not just influenza deaths, but pneumonias and stuff, which are assumed to have been secondary infections to the flu. Now, I talked to the guy that runs the World War I museum that was recently opened in Kansas City, and he disputes part of that. He thinks that they were just a little too ready to lump in all the pneumonia deaths as secondary infections, and so he disputes the 43,000. And I'm getting the sign that it's 8 o'clock.
So what was the population of the world roughly? Do you have a few?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
Okay.
I just don't know.
Locally, just if I can throw this in, there's a visual over here of marbles.
Yeah, I saw
And
that.
did you see that's for Missoula City?
Yeah.
And it's from the 1920 census, which is, Alan said, about the best we can get.
Yeah. And remember, Missoula County was bigger then, too. In 1917, Missoula County included Mineral County and also half of Lake County. Those were the last two counties formed. Superior was part of Missoula County, so was everything up to about Ronan. And then the top half of Lake County was taken away from Flathead County. So when you're looking at that population figure for the county, understand it's including the Mission Valley and the lower Clark Fork and all that. But any other questions?
When you mentioned that Ellen Leahy had written up some stuff, has she written it up in a locatable form?
I understand she's published something, hasn't she?
I'm not sure.
I read something about that. I think she has published something. Ellen, by the way, the reason she came on it is she was, with all this stuff in the news about the avian flus and all that, she was creating a plan, a Missoula County plan for how to respond. And she said, well, how did they respond to the 1918 flu? And like I said, I really used what she had as kind of a nucleus, and I did my research from what she had. But she had spent countless hours in the library reading all the Missoulians of that time. She'd gone through the hospital records, the county records. She had a handle on the figures. Those graphs, as I said, she created. She's the one that compiled the statistics for the graph. So really, I mean, we owe a huge debt of gratitude for this exhibit, really, to the work that Ellen did.
So what actually killed the people then? Their whole immune system broke down?
That's the theory, yeah.
They just died of something.
That's the theory.
Primarily
They don't know what was in the influenza virus, that particular strain that caused this overreaction. They don't have that part of the mystery solved, and they only have it corroborated. They said, this is what we thought happened then, and sure enough, it happened to these monkeys we just experimented on. But if you're a science, it's a whole thing of deductive reasoning and all that, and they haven't deducted enough things to where they're confident. It's just, that's the best explanation why the perfectly healthy people with the best immune systems, strangely, were most affected by this particular virus.
Hey, Mommy.
Any others?
Very easy to remember lessons there.
Yeah. Well, I found this fascinating, and I probably tried to cram too much information in this lecture, but it was fascinating. I started knowing just a little bit in passing about this, and it would have been great if we had the kind of budget and I'd been able to do original research and go to natural sources, but of course what we did is compile a lot of secondary sources, books. There's a couple that I'd recommend somebody looking into just to get some quick things. But this is John Barry, published this one. It's The Great Influenza. And he really goes through this whole mystery and everything, and goes to the history of the disease. It's probably the best modern look at this. There's also a book that was published in the 50s by Alfred Crosby, which has been for a long time the definitive history of the 1918 flu, and that's worth a read. This gets just a lot more into the science and stuff than Crosby did, but I read both Crosby's book, but Barry's book is out. You can get it in the bookstores, and if you want to read more about it, I'd recommend it. It's a good book. Now the other one, this is not so new, but I wanted to look into the history of the American Army in World War I, and we didn't really get into this in the lecture, but a really good small book. I'm not going to say it's the definitive history of the war or anything, but if you just want to know the American involvement, John Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower's son, wrote this book called Yanks, and basically it's just the story of how we built the Army and what our Army did during there. And if you are interested in looking into some of the military history of the war, this is a very readable, nice small read to kind of get you started, and I found it useful.
Well, now yourself, you obviously were an airborne aid man,
Yeah.
a medic,
Uh-huh.
and so that got you interested in this, and then years later, you take this retraining in the same area. So are you now going to go off into the health sciences?
No, no, no. I've had a couple careers. I've been a newspaperman and a lawyer, and I don't think I'm going to launch anything new.
His big career now, he's a blogger.
Yeah. I was one of those kids that kept himself with books. My dad used to say when we were growing up, she said, I ground him, but he never goes anyplace.
Any other questions for Alan? Thank you very much.
And I'd like everybody to give my grandson Keenan a big hand. He stayed pretty quiet through all this.
And if you would like to take a few minutes to wander around the exhibit, feel free to.